Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our presentation on the TN visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a senior associate with Scott Legal PC. Today's presentation is going to be, as I mentioned, on the TN visa. The TN visa is really a wonderful option for nationals of Canada or Mexico who are looking to come to the US to work for a US employer. And part of the reason for that is because the documentation requirement is fairly light. And also the processing time is very quick, especially for nationals of Canada. Um, we'll go into detail about why that is and what the process looks like, as well as what the requirements for the TN visa actually are. But before we do, let's go over a few housekeeping items. This webinar is part of a series. We try to do about 2 webinars a week, and those do cover a variety of topics regarding U.S. immigration law. Although our firm does focus on business immigration, we handle the full spectrum. So that includes family-based green cards, temporary visas, student visas, tourist visas, as well as, of course, the full array of business green card and temporary visa options, whether that's the E2, the TN, the national interest waiver, the EB-5, job creation green card, whatever it is, we're happy to help. So don't hesitate to reach out to us. After this presentation, you'll receive an email, and that will have a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that you see on your screen. If you don't see it, send me a message via the chat, and I'll make sure it's up. And we will also in that email send you a comprehensive guide to the TN visa, which really does pull together the best information we have on the visa, and we hope that's helpful for you. We'll also in that email have a link to our YouTube channel. We're very proud to put on our YouTube channel high quality information, obviously for free. And that includes our full length webinars. So we do record the webinars. This webinar is being recorded, and we will post it to our YouTube channel. So you can go on our YouTube channel and see our past webinars, not just on the TN, but on the national interest waiver, the EB-5, really a variety of options, as well as shorter videos. So do check that out if you're interested. If you have a question, send it to me, please, through the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function. I have both open on my screen, and I'll be monitoring those. I will likely save questions for the end, but I do plan to get through all the questions, so please don't hesitate to send those my way. And without further ado, we will go ahead and dive in by talking about the TN visa requirements. So the TN visa, to start, was founded through NAFTA. So it is rooted in an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So the first requirement to be eligible to receive a TN visa is that you have a passport from Canada or Mexico. You do not need to have been born in Canada or Mexico. All you need is a passport. So someone who was born in India and naturalized in Canada, as long as they have that Canadian passport, they are eligible to apply for a TN visa. The individual applying for a TN must be coming to the United States to work in one of the listed professions. And what that means is, if you look at the TN regulations, and I'm actually going to pull those up right now. So if you're at your computer, go ahead and Google TN regulations NAFTA, and you will see a link to the NAFTA regulations, 8 CFR section 214.6. And if you scroll down, what you will see is a list of jobs. So it starts off with accountant, and then it goes to architect, computer systems analyst. You keep going down the list, and you'll see there are also medical professionals such as dentists, dietitians, and there are also scientists, agriculturalists, animal breeders, and teachers, college, seminary, and university teachers. So there really are dozens of professions that are listed in the TN regulations. You need to be coming to the US to work in one of these professions. If you're not coming to the US to work in one of these professions, then you are not eligible for a TN visa. So that can be a problem if you're not coming to work in one of these professions. you do need to meet the required qualifications for that specific profession. So what does that mean? If you look at, let's take the first profession on the list, accountant. It says after accountant, baccalaureate or licenciatura degree, or a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. So those abbreviations are professional licenses. The baccalaureate or licenciatura degree is a bachelor's degree. So in order to come to the US to work as an accountant, you need to either have a bachelor's degree or a professional license. If we go down to, let's look at management consultant. To come to the US as a management consultant, you need either a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience. And that's 5 years of experience as either a management consultant or in the field of specialty that's related to your consulting agreement. So you see here, as an accountant, you can't qualify based on experience, but as a management consultant, you can. So you first have to figure out what profession are you coming to the US to work in. And the second step is to say, okay, what is the qualification for that profession? And do I meet the qualification? If you're an accountant, do you have the bachelor's degree or the license? If you're a management consultant, do you have a bachelor's degree or the experience? And it's different for the different professions. So you do have to do that two-step process. So when a degree is listed, if it says a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, that degree should be related to the profession. So just to take an example, if you're coming to the US as an accountant and your degree is in finance, then that's great. Finance is very closely related to accounting. If your degree is in accounting, that's even better. If your degree is in math, it is probably okay, but you see how we're starting to get a little more distant from accounting. If your degree is in economics, probably okay. If your degree is in statistics, probably okay. But if your degree is in English, then you are probably going to have a problem applying because an English degree is not clearly related to accounting. What you need to do in that situation is you actually need to look at your transcript. And you would want to highlight that you actually did take, in the example I'm giving you, where you're applying to be an accountant, that you did take accounting classes, or at least some finance classes. So you do need to show that your degree is related to the profession if you're qualifying on a degree. If you're an English major in college, applying to be an accountant, but you also are a CPA, you have that license, then the degree doesn't matter. You have the license, that's how you're qualifying. So this really does go by the regulations. So a lot of what I'll say in this presentation is going to go back to the regulations. So they really are helpful to be familiar with if you're applying for a TN. So the fourth requirement on the list is you must have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the United States. So basically what that means is an employer in the United States needs to give you a job offer. The employer really can be almost anyone or any company in the United States, as long as it is a legitimate job offer. So it can be a corporation, it can be an LLC, it can be a sole proprietorship. Let's say that someone has a law firm and it's just them. It's just them in the United States. They went to law school, they started their own law firm, and they want to hire you from Canada to be their first hire as a lawyer. That's okay. As an employer, that is okay. So the application should explain why they want to hire you, why you're qualified as a lawyer to fill that position. But in terms of do they qualify as an employer, even if they are a sole proprietor, that is fine. Now the employer does need to provide a job offer. So the TN visa is not a visa that should be used to come into the US to look for a job. If you want to look for a job in the US, the B1 is probably going to be the best option. Although, frankly, many, if not most, of the people we work with have received an offer by finding a company online, by speaking to them by phone, by applying through the normal channels. Maybe they are currently a student and they're finishing their program and they find the opportunity as a student, and then they'll be applying for the TN. But you don't want to apply for a TN for the purpose of looking for a job in the US. You will not be approved because you need that job offer to apply. And finally, this last bullet is very important. In the job in the United States, you need to actually be performing the professional activities that are consistent with the profession. What does this mean? If you went to school and you got an accounting degree, but a company in the US reaches out to you and says, hey, you are excellent at marketing. We want you to run our Facebook page, our online marketing, our social media marketing. That's going to be a problem because you cannot come to the US as an accountant, a TN accountant, and then work in marketing, right? Running their social media page. You actually need to be working as an accountant. So, how do you know what an accountant does? Or better yet, how do you know what the US government thinks an accountant does? And the answer is the Occupational Outlook Handbook, or OOH for short. So if you're at your computer and you Google OOH accountant, I'm going to use accountant as an example since it's the first on the list. You'll click on the link for the OOH. OOH, Occupational Outlook Handbook, is published by the U.S. Department of Labor, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And they have profiles on hundreds of occupations. So if you pull up the page for accountants and you see the links along the top of the page, there's one that says what they do. If you click that link, you'll see it says duties, and then a list of duties. Accountants typically do the following. They examine financial statements, they compute taxes, they inspect account books, they organize and maintain financial records, they assess financial operations, and they suggest ways to reduce costs. Those are the broad strokes of what an accountant does. So you want to make sure if you are applying to work as an accountant, a TN accountant, that your job duties are generally aligned with the job duties listed in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And this goes for any of the professions. If you're applying to be a management consultant, you need to make sure your job duties are aligned with what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says a management consultant does. If you're coming to work as a dentist, if you're anything, you need to look it up on the Occupational Outlook Handbook and make sure your job duties are aligned. Of course, you actually need to be representing that you will do those job duties in the US. And again, this is important because when you're at the consulate or you're at the border seeking entry as a TN applicant, the officer is going to say, okay, you want to come into the US to work in this profession, let's say as an accountant. So let's look at what you'll actually be doing. Will you actually be working as an accountant? And they'll want to confirm that. And in their mind, what an accountant does is what the Occupational Outlook Handbook says they do. So that really is a key requirement. One of the most common questions we get is, does the TN visa require sponsorship? And one of the reasons why the TN visa is so popular is because it truly places minimal requirements on the US employer. So to answer the question, does the TN visa require sponsorship? The first thing to do is define what sponsorship means. When most people are talking about sponsorship in the context of US immigration, what they have in mind is something like an H-1B visa or even an employment-based green card. So for those options, the employer needs to do a number of things. They need to test the US labor market, make sure that there's no qualified US worker. They need to pay typically a prevailing wage, which is almost always higher than the minimum wage should be. They need to ensure that when the person comes into the US, they are actively working and getting paid for their work. So in other words, they can't do what's called benching, where they bring someone in and then don't give them work. If the person is fired, the employer may need to pay for their flight or transportation back home. So a lot of requirements that would apply to, say, an H-1B or an employment-based green card, and that is sponsorship. The TN visa does not require any of those things. And for that reason, we say the TN visa does not require sponsorship. What the TN visa requires is that the US employer make a job offer and put that job offer in writing in the form of a TN letter. And what that is it's a letter that the employer will sign that describes who the employer is, what the job opportunity is, what the job duties are in the US, how long they plan to employ the foreign worker, um, how much they plan to pay the foreign worker, and that needs to be signed by a representative of the company. The letter needs to be honest and sincere. In other words, if the company is saying, we intend to employ this person as an accountant, here's what they'll be doing, and we plan to employ them for 3 years, that needs to be honest. They need to actually intend to do that. That does not mean that the letter is a binding contract. So if it turns out that the accountant shows up in the US and is not good at their job, the employer can fire them. Or conversely, if the accountant shows up and they find out that this is not that great of an employer, they can quit. So generally speaking, this is typical at-will employment, and there are no additional requirements from an employment perspective that would not apply to a US worker. So the TN applicant, once they enter the US with their letter, they apply at a border or at a consulate. We'll talk more about that. They'll be admitted into the US. The US employer will complete the I-9 as they would any employee, even a US citizen. They must complete the I-9. And then the foreign worker will start working and they'll be paid the standard wage as long as it's above minimum wage. And there really are no additional requirements on the employer beyond that. So we do spend a good amount of time actually speaking with employers explaining this, and we have several videos on YouTube explaining this. So if you come across an employer that is confused by this, and it is common, that they'll say, you must need sponsorship because you're applying for a visa. We are happy to explain to them, and our videos explain that this is not sponsorship in the sense that sponsorship is used in an immigration context. So we'll talk about those. Actually, let me talk about the last bullet real quick. So there is a very small distinction if the worker is already in the US and the US employer wants to apply for a change of status for the individual. So let me take a quick step back there. If you're inside the US already, let's say you're a student, you're studying accounting, and an accounting firm comes to you and says, we want to employ you as a TN visa holder, then you really have two options there. You can either say, great, give me the TN letter, and you leave. And you either, if you're a national of Mexico, apply at a consulate and come back in with your TN visa. If you're Canadian, you can do that consular route, or you can come in through a border crossing and Customs and Border Protection can issue you TN status. Or if you're already inside the US, you can apply for a change of status. So going back to my example, if you're an accounting student in F1 status, you can apply to USCIS to change your status to TN status. If you do that, if you file to change your status from another status to TN status, then the employer would file the application to change your status, and that is called a Form I-129. This does not create any additional requirements on the employer. All it is that the employer does need to sign the application requesting the change of status. And if the application is denied, then it is the employer's application which is denied. In contrast, if the employee is applying, say at a consulate or at a border crossing, that is the employee's, the worker's application. So if it's denied, that is the employee's, the worker's denial. So it is a nuance in the procedure, but the important takeaway for the purposes of this slide is it does not create any additional requirements on the employer, regardless of whether it's a USCIS application or a consular application or a CBP application at the port of entry. So I've already started touching on this, but The process is slightly different depending on whether you are a national of Canada or Mexico. And again, that depends on which passport you have, not where you were born. Um, basic, let's start with nationals of Mexico. So nationals of Mexico have two options to apply for a TN. The first is, as I said, they can apply at a consulate. The second option is they can apply at USCIS. In order to apply through USCIS, they need to be physically inside the United States. Um, Nationals of Canada have both of those options, consulate or USCIS, but they also have a third option, which is far easier and faster, which is nationals of Canada can apply at a port of entry. So that can be a land crossing, that can be an airport. So what does this look like? Basically, we'll talk more about what the actual application looks like, but the application doesn't really differ depending on whether you're applying at a consulate or Customs and Border Protection. We'll go into more details about what the application will actually include. But nationals of Canada can be issued a visa, and I'm using the term visa. It is actually status because nationals of Canada are not, unless they apply at a consulate, if they apply at a port of entry, they are typically going to just have a stamp. They're not going to have the actual visa put in their passport. That TN status is typically valid for 3 years. So they would apply at the port of entry, airport, land crossing. The border officer would allow them in TN status and would usually give them up to 3 years of status. If the employer wants to employ the person for fewer than 3 years, then they may be granted fewer than 3 years of status. Now, for a national of Canada, one of the reasons why a Canadian might want to apply at a consulate is if they have a spouse or a dependent child who is not a national of Canada. If that's the case, the spouse or the child would need to apply to consulate. And usually that means that the primary applicant would also want to join them at the consulate. But other than that, there really is not a good reason for nationals of Canada to apply for a TN visa at a consulate. Just because, again, it is so much faster and easier to just apply at a border. Nationals of Mexico, if they're outside the US, must apply at a consulate. And basically, they will be granted a visa. One of the benefits, though, is that they can be issued a visa for up to 4 years. So that is a benefit that nationals of Mexico have. They cannot apply at U.S. Customs and Border Protection. There is conflicting information that is published even by the government. The government has issued conflicting regulations and policies on this. But in practice, what we find is that nationals of Mexico, if they try to apply for TN status at Customs and Border Protection, they will almost certainly be denied, especially under the current administration. Nationals of Mexico may be eligible for renewal by mail. So that means if they have had a TN visa in the past, they need to renew that visa. They do need to physically be in Mexico to do this, but once they submit their application to the consulate might say you're eligible for a waiver or for renewal by mail, mail in your passport, and they don't actually have to go in. But the consulate will make that determination. You don't request that. But they will let you know if you qualify, and then you can take the steps there at that point. All right. We talked at the beginning about how there are dozens of professions listed in the TN regulations. Certain professions are more difficult to be approved for than others. And this is true even if you meet the qualifications. So we'll talk about two of these categories that are particularly difficult. The first is management consultants, and the second is economists. And they are difficult for different reasons. So let's start with management consultants. The reason why the management consulting category is challenging is because it is one of the very few professional categories, TN professional categories, that does not require a bachelor's degree. So if you are a national for nationals of Canada or Mexico who don't have a college degree, a bachelor's degree, the management consulting category is practically speaking the only category they can qualify for. So the government knows that, and they know that people are going to be funneled into that category if they don't have a degree, regardless of whether they're actually going to be working as a management consultant and if they qualify based on experience. So they really do scrutinize management consultant applications. The second thing that's really important to emphasize with the management consulting category is there is a spectrum in terms of risk. At one end of the spectrum, which is not risky, is if you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. So if you work, say, for Bain Consulting in Canada, and Bain wants to send you to the US to work for their office in New York City, that is not a risky application. That's quite straightforward. As long as you meet the qualifications, that's not a risky application. What is a risky application is if the employer in the US is not a management consulting firm. The example I like to use is, let's say that you are a national of Mexico and you are an expert in solar panels, designing them, the manufacturing process, things like that. And a US company that makes and sells solar panels reaches out to you and says, hey, we want you to come to the US and consult for us. We actually have this issue. Our solar panels are too expensive. We need to bring down our prices, and we want you to help us address that problem. That would be considered a risky application because the US employer is not a consulting firm. It is a solar panel manufacturer. So that being said, though, there are certainly ways to strengthen that application. So let's talk about that now. Basically, if you are applying to work in the US as a management consultant on a TN, and you are coming to the US to work for a US employer that's not a management consulting firm, what you need to make sure the application does is truly show that you are coming in to consult for the US company. And what that means is that you're coming in temporarily to address a very specific problem. So in the example I gave you, that TN application would want to make very clear, the US employer would want to make very clear in their TN letter, here is the challenge we are facing. We need to reduce costs in the manufacturing of our solar panels. To address this, we need someone to come in for a year. So a defined period of time. Typically, we recommend fewer than 3 years, because if you're asking for the full 3 years, that doesn't look really like a management consultant engagement. That looks more like a full-time employee. That's where you get into problems. So define a limited period of time that is very thoughtfully defined to show over that period of time, here is what this consultant is going to do for us. In months 1 through 4, they're going to examine our supply chain. In months 4 through 6, they're going to present to our management solutions. And then months 6 through 12, they're actually going to monitor in the system and give us feedback on it. So define actually what they're going to be doing to address that specific challenge. It can be really helpful to include in the application a management consultant agreement that actually defines the terms of the engagement, what the deliverables are, how the person is going to be paid, and that can really help to define this time frame that I'm talking about. And that can be separate from that consulting agreement, can be separate from the TN employer letter. Also, think about the compensation, the form of the compensation. So management consultants are usually independent contractors. They are hired to address a problem. The hours of their work are not necessarily relevant. It's okay if you don't show up from 9 to 5. Your job is to come and observe, make recommendations, and your job is done. So them being an independent contractor can assist with this application. If they are a full-time W-2 employee, again, it starts to look more like a full-time employee rather than as a management consultant. So you really do need to think about how can this engagement really reflect the fact that this is a temporary consulting engagement? It is not the company trying to fill a permanent role with someone who is wearing the title of TN management consultant. And that's what this third bullet on the screen is referring to is unless the applicant is coming to work for a management consulting firm, the position must be supernumerary. That's an odd word. You don't hear it often, but what it means is supernumerary is kind of not a full-time role, right? It's not a standard position at the company on their payroll. It really is one that they're bringing in temporarily to address a problem that hopefully will be resolved by the end of the engagement. So let's now switch from management consultants to economists. Economists, this category is challenging for completely different reasons from management consultant. The economist category is challenging because in 2017, the US government published a memo that basically narrowed the scope of what the government thinks an economist should be doing. Before 2017, people were coming into the US on TN visas to work as economists, and they were working as market research analysts and as financial analysts. So what those positions do, financial analysts are basically working for banks, financial institutions, hedge funds to find opportunities to earn a profit based on assets that the company manages. So they are seeking to make profits for the company, look for investment opportunities to make profits. Market research analysts are basically those who are doing exactly that. They're researching the market to basically help with advertising and increase sales. If you go on the Occupational Outlook Handbook, you can look up each of those two roles, financial analysts and market research analysts, and you can see basically the job duties that are not allowed under the economist category. So if you get an offer from a US company and you look at the job duties and they look very similar to those for financial analysts or market research analysts, you're very likely going to have a hard time getting approved in the economist category. So what do people in the economist category do? Again, you're going to have to go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And if we just search OOH economist, click that link, click what they do, you'll see economists typically do the following. They research economic issues related to education, the labor force, international trade, and other topics. They conduct surveys, they collect data, they analyze data using mathematical models, statistics, they interpret and forecast trends, they advise businesses, government, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. So if you're coming to the US to work as an economist, look at those job duties on the OOH for economists and make sure your job duties are aligned with those. If it turns out that your job duties really, they really are closely aligned with market research analysts or financial analysts, you really have two options. I should say three options. So the first option is to try to frame it as a management consultant engagement. Again, honestly, so you need to disclose what you're going to be doing, but it needs to be addressing a problem. So maybe this company has issues with their marketing, and you're coming in as a consultant to help them with their marketing. You may be able to be approved that way, but again, the application needs to be honest and sincere in what your job duties will be. The second option is to pursue another visa. So it could be that the H-1B is a better fit, something like that, possibly an E2. And finally, it just might not work. So there are times that you hopefully that you're applying for a risky category, and that there's a chance of denial. You give it a shot, and the government just says this is not approvable. In which case, unfortunately, it just won't work. But you usually can find other visa options that may work in that case. So do talk to us if you find yourself in that case. If you are denied, just since I mentioned denials, it's typically not a huge problem if you're denied based on the merits of your application, meaning they think you're not, you don't have the qualifications or you're not doing the job duties that they think you should be doing. Usually the Customs and Border Protection or the consulate will let you know, or even USCIS through a request for evidence will let you know why they think your application is not approvable. And that information, if it is something like a qualification, you may need to get the degree, you may need to get the professional license, or you might need to think about what other category you're a better fit for based on the qualifications you do have. Um, you may need to, if the issue is the job duties, you may need to speak with the employer and just say, do you have a position available that is more aligned with what the government's looking for? Again, going to the OOH and work that way. But having a TN denial does not mean you can't apply again, generally speaking. So, oftentimes if someone is denied, it may well be possible to look at the application and be strategic about looking for a different opportunity, or doing the things I mentioned before. And we're happy to help people with that if they've applied on their own and have faced a denial. So I've talked a bit already about the application process, but let's go into a bit more detail. Canadians, as I said before, can apply at a port of entry. That's an airport or a land crossing. Nationals of Mexico cannot. So a national of Canada, if they are applying, let's say they're applying at a port of entry, although this would also apply at a consulate. So if you're a national of Mexico applying at a consulate, you would provide the job offer letter, which I've been calling the TN employer letter, and supporting documentation that proves your citizenship and that you qualify. So that would be either your education, your licenses, or that you have the required experience. So if you're applying at a consulate or at the border, it's very important that your documentation be original. So don't bring copies. You can bring copies as long as you have the originals with you at the consulate or the border, because border officers and consular officers see a lot of fraud. And so they are very quick to require original documentation, including original signatures on the employer letter. So make sure you have that. You don't want to show up, take hours or even days, weeks, only to show up and find out they won't accept your copy. So bring originals, bring the original diploma, bring original transcripts if you need to point to your transcripts. If you're applying based on your experience, get letters from past employers with the original signatures printed on their letterhead, their company letterhead, talking about your past experience. So that really is important. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So if you go online, you can search for U.S. Customs and Border Protection, and you can actually find which ports of entry are kind of optimized for TN visas. And that might help, especially for a first-time applicant. One thing I always do recommend is that you call ahead. So just make sure you know what the hours of the port of entry are and if there are any unique procedures that they take into account. During COVID, we were seeing restricted hours, for example, and sometimes they would close a certain entrance and only use another. They might limit the number of people in the waiting room. Again, a COVID restriction. So a lot of that has changed by now, but point being, it's always good to call ahead. It doesn't hurt to just get a sense of what the port of entry will require. Nationals of Mexico, if they're outside the US, must apply at a US consulate. So to do that, they would file a Form DS-160 online. They would pay their visa application fee. They would schedule their fingerprints and photos, and they would be invited to schedule an in-person interview at the consulate. On the date of their interview, they would go to the consulate, have their interview. They would bring exactly the same packet that I mentioned before for Canadians applying at a port of entry. Original employer letter, the TN letter, original proof of how they qualify, whether that's degree, professional licenses, or experience, obviously their passport, and they would attend the interview. And if they're approved, they would actually get the visa in their passport. And as I mentioned before, if nationals of Mexico are applying to renew, they may be eligible to apply by mail, although the consulate will make that decision at the time of the application. Finally, regardless of whether you're a national of Mexico or Canada, if you're inside the US, you can apply for a change of status through USCIS. So in that case, as I said before, the employer is going to file that application, and it is the form I-129 that is sent to USCIS. It will be signed by the employer. And in that application, it will include copies, not the originals, of all of the documents I shared before. So a copy of the employer letter, a copy of your diploma or transcript if you're qualifying based on education, copies of your professional licenses, copies of your experience letters if you're qualifying based on experience. And finally, to wrap up before we turn to questions, some tips and common pitfalls. As I said, it always helps to call ahead to the port of entry. Make sure that the employer representative who signs your TN letter is available for a call at the time you're being interviewed at the consulate or at the time you're crossing the border and talking with the border officer. And the reason is there are times that government officers will read the letter and they'll pick up the phone and actually call the person who signed the letter. And usually they're not going to get into much detail. They just want to confirm that it is an honest and an authentic job offer. So they'll say, "Hey, I'm here with the applicant. They're telling me that you've offered them a position as an accountant. Is that true?" "Yes, that's true." "And you are the person who signed the letter, correct?" "Yes, correct." Usually it's something along those lines where they're just verifying that this is an honest application. But it's always good to tell your prospective employer, please be available. I plan to cross the border between 1 and 3. If you could just have your phone on you at that time, the phone number that's listed in the letter, in case they give you a call. As I said, bring diploma, original transcripts, and the original signed version of the employer letter. Again, many ports of entry require the original, many consulates require the original. The last point is important. I haven't touched on this, but the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. What that means is it is not a green card. It does not lead to permanent residency. You do need to have the intention of leaving the United States at the end of your TN status. That does not mean that you can't extend your TN status. You can extend your status. You can also apply to renew your TN visa. That's not what this rule is talking about. What this rule is talking about is you can't get a TN visa and enter the US with the intention of then seeking permanent residence, applying for a green card. So you really do need to have that intention of a temporary stay. Sometimes, especially if this is a repeat application, you've had a TN for 3 or 4 times, you're renewing it. The government might want to see proof of your ties outside the US. So that can be proof that you have a bank account abroad, proof that you pay a mortgage abroad, that you have family abroad. Any ties you have outside the US, they might want to see just to prove that you intend to leave, that you have ties abroad and you're not transplanting yourself permanently to the US. Again, they usually don't ask for that unless you've been on a TN for 6, 7, 8, 9 years. But it may be good to have with you just in case. And just a couple quick notes also, since these questions do come up. The TN does allow part-time work. It does allow concurrent work, so you can get approval to work for more than one TN employer. You do need to wait for the government to approve both employers before you start working for them. But it is possible as long as logistically it makes sense for you. And it is possible to change employers. So if you're in the US working for an accounting firm and you're not that happy there, and another company says, "Hey, if you want to come join us, we'd be happy for you to do that," you can file an application with USCIS, or I should say the new employer would file that application. And once it's approved, you can then go work for the new employer. Don't start with the new employer until you're approved. You can also, if you're a Canadian, do that through the border. So you can leave, come back in with the application for the new employer, and then once you're admitted, start working for the new employer. Or if you're a national of Mexico, you can apply for a new TN at the consulate for the new employer. All right. Feel free to send in. I know we've gotten a few questions. While I'm answering these, please feel free to send in any other questions that come to mind. When you say bachelor's degree, does it have to be a 4-year bachelor's degree? Is a degree equivalency document enough to justify it? That is a great question. So the TN regulations do distinguish a bachelor's or baccalaureate or licenciatura degree from what they call a certificate. Let me see the actual language they have. So the post-secondary diploma or post-secondary certificate. So I would say that if your bachelor's degree is, if you hold a bachelor's degree, so from a reputable institution, if you finish that degree in 3 years, but you have the equivalent of a 4-year degree, that is almost certainly not going to be a problem. If you want to get an equivalency certificate just to give yourself peace of mind in case the question comes up, I don't think that hurts. So you can do that. Now, a post-secondary certificate or a post-secondary diploma is not a bachelor's degree. So if your program was one of those, you don't qualify. So let's say you have a post-secondary diploma in accounting and you don't have a professional license, you're not going to qualify. You need a bachelor's degree or a professional license. So hopefully that answers your question. You do need a degree equivalency if your degree was issued outside of the US, Canada, or Mexico. So even if you got a degree in economics from the London School of Economics, highly regarded school, you still need that equivalency certificate because the school is outside the US, Canada, or Mexico. But schools inside the US, Canada, and Mexico, you generally don't need that equivalency. All right. I'm really interested to know if it's possible to apply with success for a TN if I came to the US 1 year ago, like a tourist, but I stay more than I'm supposed to. That is a complicated question. There is an answer, but please schedule a consultation. A lot depends on how long you overstayed and the nature of your violation of status. So I'm not going to get into that during this presentation because there are so many nuances and it is specific to your circumstances. So please schedule a consultation. We'd be happy to talk about that. Being a Canadian, can I say that I do not require sponsorship to my US employer? Just an offer letter is needed. So I think you should feel comfortable saying that the TN does not require sponsorship. And again, we would be happy to discuss that with the employer if they need to understand better what their responsibilities are on a TN, but none of the requirements that are generally thought of to be required under sponsorship apply to a TN. So we say that the TN does not require sponsorship. Is just an offer letter needed? No. You need a TN letter that talks about who the employer is, who the applicant is, how the applicant meaning prospective employee, how they qualify based on their education, their experience, their professional license, how long they're going to be in the US on a TN, what the requested period of time is, how much they're going to be paid. So it is more than an offer letter. It is specific to the person who is being offered the job, and it brings in the TN requirements. Do I need to submit proof of Canadian ties when submitting my documents to the CBP officer? You generally do not need to provide proof of your ties outside the US if this is the first, second, or maybe even the third TN. Once you're renewing for 3, 4 times, they might start asking you, do you really intend to leave at the end of this? What are your ties outside the US? But generally speaking, they're not going to ask that the first, second, or even the third time you're applying for a TN. If it were me, I would probably bring documents just in case they ask. So that might mean proof that I have a bank account in Canada or Mexico, if I'm paying a mortgage on a property, something like that. How long can the change of status take if you want to apply to change when already in the US? That's a great question. You have two options. You can apply for premium processing. Premium processing costs $2,800, $2,805, and it guarantees a decision. I think the current turnaround is 20 business days. The government guarantees a decision within 20 business days. So that is going to be your fastest option from within the US if you're looking to change your status. If you don't want to pay for premium processing, again, $2,800, you are looking at likely 6 months or so for the application. We can quickly look up USCIS processing times, and you all can check this as well. You would choose form I-129, form category TN, field office Vermont. 6.5 months right now is what they're estimating. So depends on how quickly you want to get that approval. With a TN visa or status, can you get out of the United States, like a trip to Mexico or to another country? Yes, you can. So if you are a national of Mexico and you have a visa in your passport, it's multiple entries. So you come in on the TN, you can leave, come back in. If you're a national of Canada and they stamp your passport, it effectively works as a visa. So if you've been approved for a 3-year period, you decide to do a trip and come back in, they will generally admit you on the same prior approval. For nationals of Canada, it can be smart to bring a copy of your application and proof that you continue working there, just in case questions come up. Bring your most recent pay stub. But generally speaking, they will readmit you after a trip, whether you're Mexican or Canadian, and you've been approved, and you're within that approval period of, say, 3 years. I'm employed as a mechanical engineer in the US under a TN. If my company wants to move me to another office in the US in a similar role, would I need a new TN? Or would I need to inform CBP or USCIS? What if there is a transition time? So 2 issues immediately come to mind. So the first thing is calling it a similar role has me concerned because your job duties, you need to maintain the same role you were approved for. So if your job duties are changing, it is likely that that is a material change in the application, and you would need approval for that. So I would say talk with a lawyer, talk through exactly what the new job duties are, how they compare to the old job duties. Also, the employer, you want to make sure it is the same employer. Even if it's a branch, it could be under a separate LLC or corporation. You don't want to run into problems where the government's accusing you of working without authorization. So I'd say schedule a consultation so that we can talk about that more. It's a good question. Can I get a TN for online jobs in the US? I'm not exactly sure what that means. So if your employer, you're never going to go to the office in the US and there's really no reason for you to be in the US, you may very well get pushback at the border. What I would say is think about if there is any benefit to you being in the US. Will you be meeting with clients? Will you need to attend meetings at your company, your employer? If you can make those arguments, then I think, yes, that's probably not a problem. But if it truly is purely online, I would anticipate getting questions about that. I would be careful about that. When looking for jobs in the US, it often indicates that applications are authorized to work in the US. How should I answer that? Well, that question is more specific than do you require sponsorship? So if the question is, are you authorized to work in the US? That's a yes/no question. Do you have employment authorization? Whether you're an F1 student, whether you have another form of employment authorization. If you don't, then the answer is no. I would still contact the employer. If that's the way they phrase the question, I would still reach out to them for a conversation to talk through exactly why they're asking the question and what their concerns are. And if their concerns are, sometimes an employer will say, we ask that question because we don't want to sponsor anyone. And then you can have a conversation with them, hopefully explaining, what sponsorship, quote unquote, is in the TN context or is not, and inviting them to speak with us if that would be helpful. But you should answer the question honestly. The reason why I feel comfortable answering the question, do you require sponsorship, In response, no, if it's a TN, is because I don't think the TN requires sponsorship. And I don't think that the TN requires what the employer is concerned about when they're asking that question. So that's why I do think no is an honest answer in response to that question. But you do need to be comfortable answering it. No. If you feel more comfortable saying, no, I feel more comfortable answering it yes, that's fine. You should answer it the way you feel comfortable answering that question. As an F2 living in the US, should I apply for a TN visa through USCIS? That entirely depends on your circumstances. Are you, not able to travel outside the US? Are you able to pay the higher fees that USCIS charges? It really comes down to a number of factors. Are you going to need to travel? Because also keep in mind, if you apply for a change of status through USCIS, that is abandoned as soon as you leave the country. So for that approval to be worthwhile, you do need to stay in the US. I'm a national of Mexico, which is already in a TN status. I want to change employer. Can I do it at a port of entry? No, you cannot. You do need to apply for a new visa at the consulate or through USCIS with the new employer. And this is what I was saying before, where there has been conflicting government guidance from the government on this. But in practice, they tend not to approve those for nationals of Mexico at the border. So I would say don't waste your time trying. What is the process of getting a social security number when you're on a TN? Is a social security number required to work? A social security number is not required to work in the United States. If you want to get a social security number, you would apply through the Social Security Administration. They have instructions on their website. So I would point you in that direction. What would be proof of ties to Canada? So you have to think broadly about this. Think about if you were sitting at a restaurant with a friend or a friend and they said, prove to me that you still have any connection to Canada, they have any connection to Mexico, what would you come up with? Like, show me the documents that prove that. Think broadly, if you're paying a mortgage, if you have a bank account abroad, things like that. You may need a letter from a family member saying, this family member has a lot of family in Canada still. They come back often to visit their family. You may have to think broadly. But again, that's not going to apply to you unless you've been on a TN for quite some time. What's the process of renewing the TN for Canadians if you'd like to continue working for the same employer? So that's a great question. Let me take a step back. You always, whether you're a national of Canada or Mexico or any other country, the moment you enter the US, you need to go online and check your I-94. The I-94 is the form the government creates that defines how long you can stay in the US and what your status is. The government makes mistakes all the time on TN forms, on I-94s. So get it fixed. It can cause issues if they make a mistake, even if it's completely their fault, which it usually is. That being said, so a national of Canada, they will be admitted for up to so you can be admitted for up to 2 years on each entry, and that's regardless of whether you're Canadian or Mexican. So that I-94 is going to give you a maximum period of stay of 2 years. So you do need to check that I-94 and leave before that expiration date arrives. So if you're a national of Canada and you want to renew, you need more time. Let's say you're at the end of that period, you would simply get a new employer letter that talks about the new time frame. We need them for I said 2 years before. It's a maximum of 3 years that they'll allow you to enter the US. So you'd want a new letter from the employer saying we need them for another 3 years. Here's their job duties, all the things in the initial letter. If you're a Canadian, you'd leave the US and you'd come back in just like an original application, and you'd have proof that you qualify, whether that's your degree, professional license, or experience, and you'd come in and you get another 3 years. Nationals of Mexico would apply for the visa at a consulate, or if you're in the US and you don't want to leave, whether you're Canadian or Mexican, you'd apply for an extension of status through USCIS. All right, I'm going to try to quickly run through these because we are up at time. Can the applicant write the TN letter of support, or does it have to come from the employer? It has to be signed by the employer. If an individual on a TN loses their job, how soon do they need to leave the US? They might need to leave ASAP. Uh, Frankly, I do believe there is a grace period. Right now, I'm not exactly sure how long it is, but I do think there is a grace period. Schedule a consultation. We can talk about the specific period of time. My TN application was withdrawn twice at the border. What will be the implication if I apply a third time with the same company? Will applying at USCIS increase my chances? Really depends on why they didn't approve it. If it was something that CBP misunderstood, then maybe USCIS will approve it because they do tend to more closely look at applications. And there's a slightly higher legal bar that they face because they can be challenged in court, whereas the border officer generally cannot be. So if it's withdrawn twice, I mean, it really comes down to the reason that you weren't approved. So I'd say schedule a consultation. We can talk through the questions you were asked, the reasons you were denied, and figure it out from there. How much does a TM visa cost? So if you're going USCIS, it's going to be about $460 to USCIS, $2,800 to expedite it through USCIS. At the consulate, it's going to be, I believe, about 400. I believe, though, check the consulate website. And then at the border, it is very cheap. I think it is $60 or so to apply at the border. What if I'm promoted with my role in TN status? Would that require a new TN? That is an excellent question. It comes down to whether your job duties change. So as long as the majority of your job duties are spent performing the job you were approved to perform, it's generally not going to be a problem. Where this can become a problem is if you start working more as a manager rather than in the profession. So the TN is not for managers. So let's take an accountant. Let's say you start as an accountant and you get promoted to the CFO, Chief Financial Officer of the company. That is probably going to be a problem because as a CFO, you're doing less of the work that an accountant does, looking at the Occupational Outlook Handbook, reviewing forms, preparing taxes, things like that. And you're doing more of management. You're overseeing employees, you're answering to the CEO. So you stop being an accountant for purposes of the TN and start being more of an executive, and that can be a problem. So I would say be aware of that risk. Reach out to us if you have questions. It can be complicated. Excellent questions. This has been a great audience. I hope this was helpful. Do reach out with any questions. We're always happy to talk with you through a consultation. So don't hesitate to reach out. We really do hope to continue the conversation with you, and do keep an eye out for our upcoming email. Check out our YouTube channel. And again, schedule a consultation if we can be helpful. Thank you very much for taking the time today. Stay well.